Okay. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Mike Gillespie. Mike is a global influencer in the area of internet security. He is director at Advent IM and VP at the Center for Strategic Cyberspace Space and Internet Studies. Advent IM is the UK's leading holistic protective security consultancy, and the Center for Strategic Cyberspace Security and Internet Studies is an international nonprofit organization that conducts independent cyber-centric research, development, analysis, and training in the areas of cyberspace. Mike, thank you for taking your time and coming to our interview today.
Oh, Boris, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. With your credentials, I believe that we will have a really thoughtful conversation about cybersecurity and emerging threats. From fears of a cyberspace-based new Cold War between the global powers to emerging fraud threats to financial services, small businesses, consumers, and work from anywhere employees, the issue of cybersecurity is likely to loom large over all technology discussions in 2021. Mike, could you tell us a short story about your unique path in the cyber field and what are you guys at Advent IAM up to these days?
Yeah, well, I think like many people who work in cybersecurity, I didn't set out to do this as a career. It was more something that I was interested in. Going back into the early 80s, I was a kid in with one of the early generation computers. As I approached 16, I told my parents I'd like to go up and work with computers, and they told me to grow up and get a proper job. Being the precocious child I was, I didn't listen to them. And of course, there weren't many jobs for people working with computers back then. A lot of it was mainframe based. We were coding on punch cards, that sort of thing. So, even back then, we could never have foreseen what the world ahead of us was going to look like in terms of connectivity. The idea in the late 80s, early 90s that we would be communicating, this was science fiction. What we're doing today was science fiction back then. So, in just 30 years, the technological advancements have meant that the way in which we can work and the way in which we communicate have changed profoundly. But yes, so I found myself in the military actually training as a biomedical scientist, only for them then to be moving into computerized record keeping. And being the only person in the unit who knew anything about computers, I ended up working with computers. So the irony was that having gone off and got a proper job, I actually ended up working with computers anyway. And from there, I was lucky. I was in there in the 90s when everything was happening as networking came along and computers became more GUI based and the internet and email was introduced. And from there, it's just been a whirlwind of trying to stay on top of the changes that occur almost on a daily basis sometimes. So very, very lucky. I've got to do a hobby for a living for 30 years and it never gets boring.
Absolutely interesting. And what are you guys in Advent IM as up to these days? What are your major kind of business model?
One of our key things that we try to do is we work with organizations at a strategic level to help them to put security processes in place, whether they're people, physical, or technological, that are specifically aligned to their business activities and their business objectives. So we want to put security in place that enables the right people to access the right information at the point of need so that they can do their jobs effectively and efficiently. And unfortunately, a lot of IT security is based around minimizing risk and focus on confidentiality. But sometimes making that information available to the frontline staff, whether it's, as we've seen this last 12 months, blue light services, the emergency services needing access to real-time data is absolutely critical. When your technology prevents that, when your security model prevents that, it actually has a profound impact, not just on your own business, but on society as a whole. So security has to be more embedded into the business and more enabling and more accommodating to manage risk rather than to avoid risk. So that's a lot of our focus, is talking to businesses about security being an embedded business process rather than something that is a specialist subject that often is seen as getting in the way.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Let's dive deep into our topic of cybersecurity, especially in this COVID area. We do a lot of work remotely. And my question is, does remote working seem like a trend that will continue even if the lockdown abate? And has COVID really ended the daily commute?
I think it's been absolutely fascinating, not just from a cybersecurity perspective, but sort of as a social experiment, if you like. And that's a terrible thing to say when we're in the middle of a global pandemic where we're looking at 2 million lives lost. But there's a lot of organizations who were entrenched in a very old-fashioned mindset about what productivity looked like. So organizations struggled to understand whether their staff were working hard if they couldn't see them. And if they can't see them, how can you be sure that they've worked there 37 and a half hours a week? But actually, that's a really out-of-date model, particularly, certainly here in the UK, where we're very much a service-based industry more than anything these days. Productivity is about output, which is about understanding what you're trying to achieve. So if we can work with our employees to understand what it is we expect from them in terms of output, does it really matter whether you work 9 to 5, 8 till 3, 7 till 11, if you take 5 hours off in the middle of the day to take the kids to the beach during the summer, assuming you're not in lockdown, of course. It doesn't. Where you work and when you work are far less important than how productive you are. And I'm speaking to a lot of people, they are definitely talking about a significant downsizing of their office space through into 2021.
Yeah.
And that's because they say, actually, what this has shown is that people can work from home and be trusted and be productive.
Mm-hmm.
So why take up anywhere from 2 to 4 hours of somebody's day every day commuting, adding to greenhouse gases, wasted time, a whole range of other factors, when actually you can get up, have breakfast with your family and be in the office for 9 o'clock and still be productive. So there's that element. The downside of that is, of course, as this has gone on, what started off as a short-term measure of people working temporarily from their spare bedroom, or in some cases using an ironing board as a desk or whatever, has become quite isolating for people. So we have to continue to use, some fantastic tools that we've got now in terms of online collaboration that we're using like we are today, but we need to use them more in terms of how we continue to engage with and touch base with our teams. So one of the things that we did from an early day, as soon as we closed the office down and sent everybody home, was on a Friday afternoon, we had a team coffee break and everybody dialed in with their coffee and we caught up on how their week was. It wasn't work. It was very much, this is about talking about you as people and, humanizing the situation and providing support and friendship and companionship for people who had found themselves in a very isolated position. Do I think this is a long-term trend? Yes, I do. Very much so. Some interesting research being done just in the last few months, and certainly here in the UK workers showed a much less desire to go back to a safe office workspace than anywhere else in Europe.
Oh. You're
Only about
individualistic, guys.
only about 34% of employees were prepared to go back to work when they could, compared with 60 to 70% in some of the other European countries. But what's also interesting is one of the pieces of research has been around people who have never worked from home before. And pretty much half of all of the people who have never worked from home before have responded to say they prefer it and want to continue to work from home in some capacity, maybe not full time, but in some capacity going forward. So I think we're going to have a much greater remote mobile workforce than we've ever had in the past.
Yeah, interesting. And from an information security perspective, was the rollout to remote a success, and what will we expect in the future with regard to security of this communication?
Well, I think we had organizations who were well prepared, who already had an agile mentality, who were already gearing up to having a larger remote workforce, and they dealt with it pretty well. Um, a lot of organizations almost had to mobilize their workforce with 24, 48 hours notice. So there are potential challenges further down the line in terms of how devices were procured and rolled out. We've got a significant amount of people who've never worked from home before, so maybe don't have the home working security culture that we're going to have to deal with. And we're going to have to spend more time on quality education and awareness and engagement with those people to make sure that they continue to be a secure workforce in the same way that they would be whilst in the office.
Mm.
Um, so, you know, things like policy, education, engagement, and technology will probably have to be reviewed and brought up to date in retrospect, which is always a challenge. But we mustn't forget that those things need to be done as we deal with the emerging challenges as well.
Mhm. And
Otherwise, we'll
what are
actually
these?
leave a big black hole behind us.
Mhm. And what are these additional risk the remote working offer businesses? So we have a new risk that require really special attention from your experience this year.
Well, I think one thing we saw was almost a tripling of the amount of malicious traffic directed at home workers. Now, in some markets, they are using the term that there was an increase in security incidents, but actually, in the main, there weren't. There was an increase in malicious traffic, but that hasn't necessarily converted into an increase in breaches, which we would consider to be an incident. So our workforce has generally responded quite well. Of course, what we know is that a phishing attack is more likely to succeed anytime when our workforce are under stress, pressure, when they are distracted, when they find themselves in a position where they're in an uncomfortable or unusual position. All of that the last 12 months, that's pretty much sums up all of those things. So we have to be careful to stay engaged with our staff. The big thing I see with IT security education is often we tell users what we don't want them to do, but we don't necessarily engage with them to give them a set of principles to understand what we do want them to do. And it's all very well saying to somebody, don't click on a phishing email, but if they don't know what a phishing email looks like, they don't know how to recognize it, and they don't know how to react when they do get one, then they can't behave in the way in which we do want them to behave.
Mhm.
And you know, you can say to a child, don't go any further than 200 meters. But if they don't know what 200 meters is like, you can't expect them to stay within your distance. It's
Mhm.
the same with security education. We need to provide them with the education, not just the rules. And that's going to be vital, I think, going forward, is we've got to move to much more of a principle-based rather than a rule-based situation with policy. So staff know what we're trying to achieve and work with us to be part of the solution, rather than feel like they're continually being told, don't do that, don't do that, don't do
Mhm.
that.
Mhm. So, how do the information security professionals feel about such a widespread remote requirements, and has increased this pressure on there? Because normally, if you are in office environment, you have your 9 from 5, and you know. But if you are at home environment, it's actually can be whole day you working for your boss.
That's right. And I think there's a series of sort of splits appearing in the people I'm talking to. There are those that are horrified at it because they believe that unless you can see the user, you can't trust them to do the right thing. There are those who are embracing it as a new way of working, and they're stepping up to the challenge and working with their organization to take them to a place of maturity where this can be achievable. And then there are those who have already gone through that change curve, who already recognize that, you know, when was the last time you saw a static desktop in an organization anyway? Most of our users have been mobile to some extent for a long time. We just haven't been recognizing that. And so, you know, There's a whole range of professionals out there, depending on the organization they work for and the culture they're used to working within. And that also goes for the sectors as well. When you've got highly regulated sectors where there's a fear of information loss, they tend to be much slower towards moving towards allowing staff to work remotely. And so they've got a much bigger uphill journey now to get themselves to a place of maturity to manage this safely. But safe management is possible. We just need to embrace it and move forward with it as a new way of working.
Mhm. So, what part has the relationship between the communication and security played in the remote working success, or maybe also aspect of senior leadership attitudes changing in adapting this work from home environment?
Yeah, again, I think the pretty much the same sort of split that you had organizations that were quite mature who understood that users were intelligent, adults, motivated. You know, the vast majority of employees, they want to do a good job and they don't need somebody sitting on their shoulder all the time for them to do a good job. But there are still some middle leaders in particular who their approach is still very much that if you don't keep an eye on your staff, then they will slack off. And so now, how do we know they're slacking not? How do we know they're not slacking off because they're working from home and we can't see them? And they're the ones that are struggling with this hiatus. And then the third group are those that have been shocked by it at first and then seen their staff because they've allowed them to find their way of working. They've actually seen their staff productivity increase, not decrease.
Mhm.
But I think what we've also seen is, and we were talking to organizations a lot about this over previous years, organizations that embrace the other skills that they have within their organization. So people who work in marketing, communications, training and development, leadership and development, where they have all been involved in this new model, they're being much more successful. In the nicest possible word, a lot of IT people aren't particularly good communicators. They, you know, and certainly we often see that communication is seen as a soft skill rather than a skill that is integral to being a good security manager. So if you're not a very good communicator and you're not from an education background, why are you expected to create education content for your user base?
Mm.
Surely you should be using your subject matter experts, which are your comms, marketing, even you know, people who have got a good understanding of human psychology and human behavior. You know, if you can get behaviorists and psychologists and people like that who are an integral part of the development of your education program, you're going to develop education that changes culture and behavior rather than education that ticks a box.
Yeah, interesting. So, uh, some security news we saw lately reporting the rise in sales of software to remotely monitor stuff, and this is sold as kind of productivity monitoring. What are your thoughts on this, and where do you think the line between spying and a reasonable monitoring lies? What do employees need to be wary of legally and ethically?
Well, I think the first thing that strikes me about a lot of these tools is how quickly the sales team started to focus on the functionality that these tools had to be deployed in stealth. Now, to me, where I'm talking about a culture of openness and engagement and trust and developing staff to be an integral part of the solution,
Mhm.
to then deploy a remote monitoring tool in a stealth mode without employees being aware of it, that allows employers to access their webcams, their microphones, to monitor their keystrokes, to see what's on their screen. That, just from a pure ethical perspective, to me, strikes the wrong tone.
Mhm.
But legally, of course, certainly here in the UK, our information commissioner has been very strong for some years now, saying employee monitoring is all well and good, but it has to be open, transparent. Staff need to know what their rights are, and all of the information that's collected as part of employee monitoring falls under personal data and needs to be collected, processed, and dealt with in a safe and transparent manner. So again, you know, Are staff going to work harder just because you've got a piece of software on their screen? You know, I've worked in organizations in the past where people have had flexi time. So if they come in half an hour early and go home half an hour late, they accrue an hour's worth of flexi time. And over a course of months, that builds up to an extra day's holiday. That doesn't mean that they worked any harder or any more productive. It just means they worked an hour longer each day.
Mhm.
But actually, that's convenient to them because it gets them in before the traffic and they leave after the traffic. Productivity software is only going to work if it's deployed in a way that's actually going to enable the employee to work better, to work more effectively and more efficiently. If all it's there is to provide an extra pair of eyes to spy on them, you're going to drive down your motivation, you drive down your engagement, you drive down, to a degree, you drive down all of the employees' loyalty to your organization because they feel devalued as a result of that. And that's before you get into the legality of deploying it in stealth mode, which is a data protection GDPR nightmare waiting to happen.
Mhm. Interesting. I would like to take this opportunity and ask you about this massive breach involving SolarWinds and allegedly Russian hackers. How do you think about this incident as a professional, and how should we think about it as individuals, consumers, and so on, etc.?
I think what it has shown once again is the potential frailty of the whole software supply chain. That if you can insert anything malicious at a prime level, so you can go to the source. You know, and if we move away from SolarWinds, but just think about something that everybody will be using on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, if you're using a Microsoft operating system, you're probably automatically downloading and deploying Microsoft patch updates. Now, if I can subvert that and insert something that is malicious into those patch updates, we are, as a supply chain, as consumers, we are trusting that the ultimate source of these updates is trustworthy. And that's exactly the same, you know, with SolarWinds. Once you get in at that level, everything that is downstream from that, all of the cascading of the updates and proliferation of those software updates is going to get corrupted. So you target one organization, but you compromise thousands. That's, to me, that's a much bigger return on investment than trying to hack thousands of organizations.
Exactly.
And we've seen this within the finance sector. You know, we've seen it with point of sale systems and finance systems, Swift banking system. It just continues to show, excuse me, it continues to show the frailty of that whole software supply chain. And really, we say supply chain, but is it a chain? It's more like a web, isn't it? It's more like a whole ecosystem of onward cascade and demand. So I think we haven't, I don't think we've seen the last of SolarWind compromise in terms of what its potential is going to be going forward. What we do know is that we've already got some major organizations. I think FireEye was the first one to come out and talk about it, who have had significant compromise, not just of themselves, but their whole client base potentially.
Mhm.
So supply chain assurance is an area that still is very immature. It's very few organizations could genuinely tell you who was in their supply chain, and probably no more than one or two arm's length from an organization. You have no visibility of who you're connected to at all.
No. They call it now third-party risk management, kind of new discipline. Right.
Yeah, and that's what we keep doing is we keep calling it a new name and give it a new discipline, but actually it's an age-old thing, which is supplier assurance. And anybody who has access to directly or indirectly your information systems is a potential threat as well as a potential ally. But that also has to include any organization that you are dealing with within your supply chain for offline management of your information as well. You know, we talk a lot now about cybersecurity, but when I first got involved in this world, it was information security. And sometimes that focus on cybersecurity has led us away from acknowledging that we still have a huge amount of offline information, paper-based, our archiving and backups, all of those information assets need to still be part of our security strategy, because quite often we're devolving the management of them. If you think about now, we're talking about doing cloud backups, but where's the cloud backup? And who have they subcontracted the storage of cloud backups to? And what about the offline storage of the cloud backup that was outsourced by your initial cloud service provider? So already we're 4 links down the supply ecosystem, and we have no idea now who's handling our information.
Mm-hmm.
And, I can remember it's not that many years ago, we were being told, go cloud, it's more secure. Cloud is more secure than you can do it yourself. Go cloud is more resilient. Cloud will be more resilient than you can, and it'll be more cost effective as well. Now we're being told you have to buy cloud security. Well, the reason I went cloud was because cloud was secure. Yeah, no, it's not actually secure. You need to buy cloud security as an overlay. Oh, and you need to buy cloud resilience. Hang on. But I bought cloud because it was resilient. Yeah, but you need additional cloud resilience now. And therefore, you need to back up your cloud. And therefore, you need to back up the backup to your cloud. Oh. And all of a sudden, you're like, well, hang on a second. This is 4 times more than I was doing when I had managed it myself. Yeah. And it's that whole, the emperor's new clothes, that the fairy tale. It's kind of like we're sold something continually. It's like an arms race. We're being sold these technologies as a panacea. Mm-hmm. But of course, once you've bought that technology, the supplier has to go and find a new technology to sell you. Otherwise, where's their revenue stream going to come from next? It puts me in mind, I was back in the days when we could go to exhibitions. I went to an exhibition in London and everybody was selling drone technology.
Yeah.
Buy drones and make them an integral part of your physical security solution. Then the next year, drones were the threat. So now you have to buy drone detection and disabling technology because everybody had drones. Yeah, you sold us all drones. Now you're selling us technology to protect drones.
The same companies.
Exactly the same companies, yeah. And I think sometimes the IT world's a bit like that. They sell us a solution to a problem we didn't know we had, and then tell us that's caused a problem that we now need to buy another solution for.
Interesting. So let's discuss about Brexit and data protection risk. How will EU-based data controllers and processor with customers' data or an establishment in the UK now, how to interact with UK data protection authorities?
Oh gosh, I mean, isn't this just one of those, $30 million questions now? Is we're so close to having gone through Brexit that what is on the horizon is almost it's just a blank page at the moment. I mean, we have the agreement now that we're going to be able to continue to have open borders in terms of data transfers. But of course, we also now potentially need to have representatives in each other's country who can, if we're doing processing, marketing to, selling into, or storage in another country, where we're going to have local representatives who can represent us to the regulator in each of those countries. So I potentially might now need to have somebody who is a data protection officer based in any other country where I'm doing work. And you might need to get representatives like me in the UK to represent you to the UK's Information Commissioner's Office if you need to deal with them in the event of a breach. So it introduces a potential overhead and complication that organizations are only just starting to get to grips with. And and that's data protection, which is, I think the freedom of information movement, as much as freedom of movement, is absolutely vital to business in the 21st century. And we have only just in the last couple of weeks got clarity over the rules of what that information movement is going to look like. So I think what I would say is, if we've got lorry drivers being stopped at borders now and having their ham sandwich confiscated, just think how much more complicated data protection is than whether you can or can't bring a ham sandwich into the country.
Yeah. So let's do a last question. Last question. What if, for example, if someone who is listening to this interview would like to walk away with just two major takeaways, what would it be?
I would say that in 30 years, I have seen several things happen. One is which the pace at which we expect people to work is faster than ever before. And that reduces thinking time, which increases the potential for mistakes to be made. And many data breaches actually are human error, not a concerted attack. Even where we have a network incursion by, I'll use the term hacker, but hacker just means so many different things these days. Often that network incursion has been facilitated by our own people, either making a mistake or because we don't allow our technical teams the time and the luxury to manage the technology properly. The number of organizations who won't allow network downtime to allow patches to be applied, and then scream blue murder when their network gets compromised, they're hit by ransomware, and they lose 3 weeks of productivity. So we have to understand that maintenance of our people, education, awareness, and upskilling, but also maintenance of the technology that we invest in is an ongoing thing, not a capital expenditure. You can't just do it once and then expect it to look after itself. Second thing is that over the last few years, we've increasingly used the term cyber, and it has made us focus, and to some extent, rightly so, on the external threat. But many of the threats to our information assets continue to come from inside our organization. We need to go back to looking at our security holistically, because the threat is holistic, but at the moment our response isn't. There are a lot of seminars that I attended in the last 2 years talking about the future of convergence, physical and cyber coming together. It happened. The threat converged and our response didn't. So if we're going to focus on anything for the 12 months ahead, it would be improving our coordinated, holistic security response, and understanding that education is not about 20 minutes once a year. It's an ongoing process that keeps users aware of their need to be part of the security solution.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike. I wish you great success with your future growth plans, and for post-COVID, maybe still in COVID life. And I hope that our members will find this interview very useful.
Thank you very much for having me today, Boris. I really appreciate it. And best of luck with the continuing success and growth of the network as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.